Russian assault operations continue, and our forces maintain all necessary combat activity. The most intense situation remains in the Donetsk region, particularly in the Pokrovsk direction. We are also continuing active operations in the Kursk and Belgorod regions. This is our active and effective defense of the Sumy region, the defense of the Kharkiv region. Since the start of the Kursk operation in August, the Russian army has suffered significant losses, more than 63,000 killed and wounded in that area alone. Our forces have also managed to substantially replenish the exchange fund for Ukraine. Unfortunately, the Russians show no signals of a ceasefire, and they are not yet ready to end the war. Therefore, all our forms of pressure, all our work with partners to put pressure on Russia are absolutely necessary.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says that President Trump has made no concessions to Kremlin. U.S. senators threatened to impose sanctions on the Russian economy. Meanwhile, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin has supported the idea of annexing the Ukrainian city of Sumy. So what does Rubio say about Trump's concessions to Putin, and why does Kremlin want to capture the Ukrainian city of Sumy? U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio insisted on Tuesday that President Trump has made no concessions to Kremlin because sanctions against Russia have not been lifted even after a phone call. Quote, Putin hasn't gotten a single concession. Moreover, Rubio says that his administration is working to bring more air defense systems to Ukraine. However, Rubio said that Trump does not want to impose new sanctions on Russia because, in such case, Russians could withdraw from negotiations. As we know, Donald Trump has a phone call with Russian dictator Putin. After a 2-hour conversation with Putin, he said that conditions of a peace deal could only be negotiated between Russia and Ukraine. The US president has not lost his temper with Putin, despite the fact that Putin has not accepted his ceasefire proposal. Putin rejected 30-day ceasefire proposal and made no concessions. Despite these developments, Trump was happy about the phone call and was not interested in inflicting pain on Russia. Putin instead said that his country is ready to work with Ukraine to craft a memorandum on a possible so-called future peace agreement. Putin also emphasized that any resolution would have to address the root causes of the conflict, which mean capitulation of Ukraine and so-called demilitarization. On Truth Social, after the phone call, Trump says that Russia and Ukraine will immediately begin negotiations, adding that the condition for that will be negotiation between two sides. However, President Trump did not mention that such negotiations had already taken place in Istanbul, where Russia issued another ultimatums and demanded unrealistic concessions from Ukraine, such as full withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from its own 4 regions, even from those parts which Russia does not fully occupy. Meanwhile, during a call with European leaders, Donald Trump said that Putin was not ready to end the war because he believes that Russia is winning, according to the Wall Street Journal. These talks took place after a 2-hour telephone conversation between Trump and Putin. European leaders had previously understood that Russian dictator was not ready to end the war, but this is the first time they have heard this from Trump. Although Trump appears to have reached the conclusion that Putin is not ready for peace, this did not force him to do what the Europeans and President Zelensky are seeking, to tighten sanctions. However, even before a phone call, Trump has had a conversation with European leaders, and during the call he made it clear that he could tighten sanctions if Putin refused to cease fire. Also on Monday, after the conversation with Putin, the American president had probably changed his position again. He also said he wanted to resume talks at a level between Russia and Ukraine in the Vatican. Additionally, U.S. Senators Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham reminded Russia about their bill on new sanctions against the Russian economy. Senators stated that they have more than 80 votes in support of it in the absence of real steps from Moscow to end the war. The document refers to 500% tariffs on those countries that buy Russian energy resources, uranium and some other goods. Congressmen are also waiting for Russia's response with a list of conditions for a ceasefire. Quote, the law we introduced isolates Russia, turns it into an island, in terms of trade, imposing large tariffs on other countries that support its atrocities. One of the priorities of our law is to ensure that China is responsible for fueling Putin's war machine by buying cheap Russian oil, which is delivered by the Shadow Fleet. Meanwhile, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin supported the idea that the Ukrainian city of Sumy should be annexed by the Russian side. During the meeting with the heads of local governments, Putin asked how far Ukrainian forces should be driven away from the border. Sumy should be ours, suggested Pavel Zolotaryov, and this idea was supported by dictator Putin. Although Putin is open to capturing the city of Sumy, Ukrainian armed forces continue their operations in the Kursk regions of Russia. Also, Putin directed Russian forces to create a so-called buffer zone along the border with Ukraine. Putin told a government meeting, but he gave no details about these military plans.
I have already said that a decision was made to create the necessary security buffer zone along the borders. Our armed forces are now actively solving this problem. The enemy's firing points are being suppressed. The work is underway. At the same time, I would like to draw attention to the fact that already now, naturally, taking into account the situation in the Kursk, Belgorod, Bryansk regions, we must begin work to restore and rebuild everything that was destroyed.
At the same time, President Trump presented his plan for a Golden Dome missile defense program that he said would cost more than $175 billion to complete over the course of the 3 years. Trump was also asked if he had spoken to dictator Putin about the issue of Moscow developing its own space-based nuclear weapons. The president said that he hasn't discussed it with Putin yet, but plans to do so. Also, Trump commented on the possibility of imposing sanctions against the Russians. Trump said that he hasn't decided yet whether to impose sanctions on Russia over the war with Ukraine, saying that this will be his determination.
Thank you, Mr. President. When you first announced this idea, critics said it would be prohibitively expensive, potentially ineffective, and could trigger an arms race in space. What do you say to those critics about that?
Well, they're wrong. It's about as close to perfect as you can have in terms of real production. I told you Canada wants to be a part of it, which be, fairly small expansion, but we'll work with them on pricing. We'll be dealing with them on pricing. They know about it very much. They've asked to be a part of it, actually. They've asked us to be a part of it. I think it's something that is great. If you can afford to do it, we can afford to do it. We took in $5.1 trillion in the last 4 days in the Middle East. So we have things that nobody else can have. You see what we've done helping Israel with that. You probably wouldn't have an Israel. They launched probably 500 missiles altogether, and I think 1/2 of a missile got through, and that was only falling to the ground as scrap metal. It's pretty amazing, and this is in terms of technology far advanced from that system.
And just one follow-up on the adversaries. Have you addressed Russia's ventures in space with a space-based nuclear weapon and told Putin to stop in your conversations with him?
We haven't discussed it, but at the right time we will, yeah.
Mr. President, are you confident that you can get the funding needed from Congress quickly?
Yeah. It's amazing how easy this one is to fund. Some funding is tough and some is easy. When we say we're going to save everyone's lives in a crazy world, it seems to be very easy to get. Yeah, we've already spoken to everybody that we have to speak to. Everybody's in. I would say, Dan, everybody's in line here. Right?
Yes, sir. $25 billion is a down payment in the budget reconciliation bill right now.
Yeah. So I think people.
Mr. President, on Russia, are you worried about the reports on a military buildup along the borders towards Finland and Norway?
No, I don't worry about that at all. They're going to be very safe. Those are two countries that are going to be very safe.
And secondly, sir, if I may, Volodymyr Zelensky is saying today that he's hoping for you to impose new sanctions on Russia. Are you considering that?
Well, that's going to be my determination. That's going to be nobody else's determination. We'll see how Russia behaves. We see what's going to happen. We have a pretty critical time right now. I had a talk yesterday for 2.5 hours with President Putin, as you know. I also spoke to all of the European, or to many of them.
Meanwhile, the Netherlands would like Ukrainian President Zelensky to be invited to the NATO summit on June 24-25 in The Hague. NATO Czech General Mark Rutte and Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof stated this. The Dutch Prime Minister and NATO Secretary General asked journalists to wait a little for an answer to the question of whether President Zelensky will receive an invitation to the NATO summit in The Hague. But during the NATO summit in The Hague, the alliance members will discuss military support for Ukraine to ensure that it is in the best position in Ukraine to continue the fight and that the peace agreement after the end of the hostilities will be durable, quote. We will soon announce the exact program of the summit. As for us, we would like to welcome President Zelensky to The Hague.
What I want from this The Hague summit is it has to be a splash. It has to project NATO at the world stage, not only being from history the most successful defense alliance ever, but also going forward. And indeed, that means that we have to concentrate on three big issues. One is defense spending. The other one is making sure that our defense industrial base is able to produce what we need to have to make sure that when it comes down to the ongoing and long-term Russian threat, when it comes down to this Chinese build-up. We know that North Korea, China, Iran and Russia are working more and more collectively. Look what is happening in Ukraine. North Korea, China and Iran are actively supporting Russia's war effort in Ukraine.
That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and glory to Ukraine.